So it's time to take a look at the math worksheet that you have for closing prorations. Not quite yet the closing statement itself, but the prorations part of closing. And remember, proration is just taking those expenses that are related to the closing of the property and breaking them down into daily amounts so that we can make sure that the parties are only charged for their fair share of what happens. And that does get a little bit more complex on these closings because you have to start to deal with it in terms of debiting someone and crediting someone versus just figuring how much this party owes and that party owes and charging both of them. You have to figure out a way to handle it with one party being debited and one party being credited. And so we want to really practice that and get it nailed down because it's math that I believe you'll see on the test. So I'm going to open up the worksheet here and we're going to jump right into taking a look at how to do these. Okay. So on number one, it says, what are the prorated amounts owed for annual property taxes for both the buyer and the seller on a home with an annual tax bill of $31.50 and a closing scheduled to take place on July 18th? So this one is sort of an introductory question. They're not really asking us for how it's going to be handled on the closing statement. They just want to know the amounts. They want to know the buyer's amount and the seller's amount. How much does the buyer owe for the taxes? How much does the seller owe for taxes? So we're going to be looking at two different numbers here. The buyer's part of the year and the seller's part of the year. And I always like to think of a proration in a timeline sort of scenario. And you've got the left side of the timeline is always the seller's side, and the right side is always the buyer's side. And in this case, our timeline, because we're prorating property taxes, starts on January 1 and goes all the way through December 30th because property taxes are something that's billed on an annual basis. And we've got our closing here July 18th. And so if you kind of think of the year in two pieces here, we've got, I'll do the seller side over here in green, and then you've got the buyer's half of the year over here in red. Okay. And so what they really want to know is what are those two pieces? And together they have to add up to the 3150, the $3,150 collectively is going to be paid by both of these parties, and we're going to handle that through closing. Now, they're not asking how we're going to handle on the closing statement. They just want to know the pieces here. So what I think we should probably start with is a number of days, and I'll try to stay color coordinated here. We'll do the seller side in green. So if we think about a number of days for the seller, that period of time is going to be January 1 through July 18th for the seller. And so if we think about that, that's January is 30 days, February is 30 days, March is 30 days, April is 30 days, May is 30, then you've got June 30, and now we're into July, but July is only 18 days because we're only going to the 18th. So you can either add those together or you can say, okay, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times 30 is 180 plus the 18. However you do it, you should make sure you come up with 198 days here for your seller, okay? 198 days for the seller is a number that we need to know. And then the buyer side, let's swap my color out here. The buyer side is from July 19th through December 30th. The good news is we've already done the hard work because since we already counted the seller's days, we can just say 360, which is total number of days in the year, minus the 198 that the seller was going to be responsible for. And that leaves us with 162 days for the buyer. Okay, so the seller's got 198 days, the buyer's got 162 days. That gets us on a good starting. Let me write the word days in there. So we're well on our way here. Now we know the time that needs to be prorated. Next step is just going to be to figure out how much that time is going to cost. So let's look at this. We've got 3150 for the year. If we divide that by 360, that'll get us down to our daily amount. Okay, 3150 divided by 360. That is $8.75 per day. And then if we're looking at the seller side, that's $8.75 a day. Scroll up, give myself some room here. Times 198 days for the seller. That's $1732.50 for the seller. And then we come over here on the buyer side and we say the same $8.75 a day times 162 days for the buyer. That's 1417 and 50 cents for the buyer. And if we want to check our work, of course, we could add those two together and make sure they add up to the total bill of $31.50. So I'm going to do that. $1417.50 plus $1732.50. That adds up to the total bill, so I know those numbers make sense. So there's my buyer side. Let's do it this way. And then here's my seller side. And those are the prorated amounts owed by each party. We're not talking about debits and credits here because it didn't ask us how we would include it on the closing statement. Okay, let's look at number 2. It says, what are the prorated amounts owed for annual property taxes for both the buyer and seller in a home that is located in a municipality with an annual tax rate of $1.05 per 100 and has an assessed tax value of $415,000 if closing is scheduled for April 10th? So again, they want us to do the same thing here. They want us to take a timeline. And we've got on the left-hand side the seller starting January 1. And on the right-hand side, we got the buyer going up to December 30th because we're doing property taxes, so it's a full year. And it says here we got a closing somewhere in here, April 10th. Okay, so if we look at this, all right, there's our buyer side. There's our seller side. And when they want to know how much we need to account for with each side. So if we talk about the seller, that's going to be January 1 through April 10th. And if we talk about the buyer, that's going to be April 11th through December 30th. Remember, there's no overlap here. When you're prorating between the two parties and there's a buyer side and a seller side, they don't overlap. The day of closing simply goes to the seller. And then the day after that goes to the buyer. So now that we've got the time periods, let's count days. Let's go ahead and count the days. And I always count seller days because I can get the buyer side by subtracting. Okay, so I've got January is 30, February is 30, March is 30 again. And then I get to April. I'm not going to do 30 for April because we're only going up to the 10th of the month. So that looks like 100 days to me for the seller. And of course, the buyer side days is just going to be 360 minus the 100 that the seller is paying for. That's 260 days for the buyer side of things. Okay. Now, in this question, we can't jump right into breaking that annual tax bill down into a daily amount because they did not give us the tax bill. It's not something that we were given. We have to figure it out. This takes us all the way back to Unit 2.3. And do we remember how to calculate an annual tax bill? This is where you start to pull all those formulas together. And the annual tax bill is always equal to the assessed value times the rate. If you don't know these formulas, you have to memorize them. Do not tell yourself that you can't memorize formulas. You can memorize formulas. Everybody can memorize formulas. That's not a math thing. That's a stubbornness problem. If you say you can't memorize math formulas, you're being stubborn. If your child told you that and they were in the third grade, you would say, yes, you can. You sit there until you memorize it. Don't make excuses for yourself. I love you, but you make a lot of excuses for yourself as adult learners sometimes. You can memorize formulas. There's less than 10 of them throughout the entire class. Make one card for yourself that says property taxes on the top of it and put this formula on it. And literally sit there and go, okay, tax bill, assessed value, rate. Tax bill's on top. Tax bill, assessed value, rate. Tax bill's on top. Tax bill, assessed value, rate. Tax bill's on top. And you say that over and over and over repetitively until it is burned into your brain. And there's a formula memorized. And so anytime you're asked about a tax bill and you don't have the tax bill, you know how to write that formula out. Because that's what's key to doing these kinds of questions where you got to pull everything together. I promise you can do that. So now that we have the formula written down, we know that the tax bill is going to equal the assessed value times the rate. Well, they gave us an assessed value of $415,000 and they gave us a rate of 1.05% because that dollars per hundred is the same thing as a percentage. So here's what we know. The annual tax bill, because these things are side by side, we can multiply them. $415,000 times 415,000 times 1.05%. That equals a tax bill of $4,357.50. $43.57.50 for the annual tax bill on this property. Now we're ready to start to break that down into a daily amount. If we divide that by 360, we will get our daily amount. And that is $12 and about 10 cents a day, 0.1041 per day for the property taxes, a little over $12 a day. Now we're ready to do the two sides here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the seller side first, and we'll stick with our color coding here and keep the seller side in green. I don't need any of the questions, so I'm going to scroll up out of the way there, get that out of my way where I can see. Sorry, get this out of the way. Now, when we take a look at this, we're going to simply go on the seller side. We know we've got $12.1041 a day times, and we already figured out that's 100 days. Okay. So if we do the math there, that's going to be $1,210.41 for the seller. Now, we can do the buyer in a couple of different ways. I'll show you two different ways you could come up with the buyer from here. We could again go back and say our $12, $12.10.41 per day times the 260 days. Okay, so 12.1041 times 260, that equals 3147.06 or 07, depending on how you want to write it out, if you want to round it for the buyer. The other way, folks, we could have done this, if you really wanted to, is to simply say, okay, well, the total tax bill is $4,357.50, and we know that the seller's paying $12.10.41, and if we subtract those two, we'll get $31.47 and about 9 cents. And I know some of you will say, oh, that's a different answer. No, it's not. Look at them. They're 2 cents apart. Whenever you're dealing with big numbers and prorating and rounding, a couple of cents here or there is going to be fine as far as final answers go. You can go either way with that. The key here is once you know one side, it's easy to get the other side. Okay, so we've got a buyer number here of 31.47 and about 7, 8, 9 cents, somewhere around there, and we've got a seller number here of about 12, 10, 40, 41, 42, somewhere around there for the seller. Any of that's fine. You're good to go. Because obviously, even being off by a day is going to throw you off by $12. So rounding a few cents either way, it's fine. It's fine. All right. Number 3 says, what's the correct tax proration entry for both the buyer and seller on a closing statement for a property that is scheduled to close on December 10th, 2019, where the annual property tax bill of $26.40 has been paid in full by the seller prior to closing? So now this is a little bit different question. I'm going to highlight why it's a little bit different question. It says, what's the correct tax proration entry for both the buyer and the seller? Entry means on the closing statement. That's where you need to have those debits and credits. Okay. That's what entry means. What's going on the closing statement. That's where you get into your debit credit scenario there. So, and obviously on the exam itself, you would know that because the answer choices are all going to say debit credit. It would be very clear that that's what they're looking for you. But I just wanted to show you here how you see that that's what they're asking for. When they talk about the entry, they're talking about on the closing statement and what it would be there on the closing statement. So that's where we need this debit credit scenario. So the first thing we're going to do is draw our timeline, because any proration we need to visually, in my opinion, see. Okay, we got the seller side of the timeline on the left, the buyer side of the timeline on the right. And because this is property taxes, we know the timeline starts on January 1st and goes all the way through December 30th. Now this one, the closing is very close to the end of the year. December 10th, closing right here. So if we do our little highlighting here, the seller side is much larger than the buyer side. And learn to just kind of recognize that right away. Most of this bill is going to be paid by the seller or owed by the seller. Most of this bill is owed by the seller. Very little of this bill is owed by the buyer. So now we need to look at what happened with the bill and talk about, is that fair or not? And here's what happened with the bill. Okay. It says seller paid entire bill. That's not fair. It's not fair that the seller paid the entire bill, because the seller paid the green part and the red part. They only owed the green part. So what that tells me is this is unfair to the seller. So we need to credit the seller, which means we need to debit the buyer. That gets my credits and debits figured out. It's unfair what happened to the seller, so we're going to fix it. We're going to credit the seller something, which means we're going to debit the buyer something. The question is, what is the something? And that's where you go to, okay, what was the mistake? What was wrong? What did the seller pay for that was unfair? What is it that we're trying to fix? And what the seller paid for that was unfair, folks, is this part of the year over here. The seller should never have paid for that portion of the year. That should have been paid for by the buyer. So the way for us to fix it is to deal with that part of the year. So what we want to do is credit the seller and debit the buyer for the period of time from December 11th through December 30th. That's our proration right there. It's one period of time, December 11th through December 30th, because that was the problem period of time. And we want to credit that to the seller and debit it from the buyer. If you don't understand that right now, stop, back up, go back, watch this again, listen to the reasoning. If you have to listen to the reasoning 10 times in a row, that's okay. It will eventually sink into you that the reason we're doing this is what happened in the real world. The fact that the seller paid the entire bill is unfair. So that means to make it fair, we need to credit the seller back for their overpayment. They overpaid. Anytime somebody overpays, you give them a credit to fix the overpayment. Well, the seller overpaid here, so we're crediting them. Well, if we credit the seller, we have to debit the buyer. You don't need to understand why we're debiting the buyer other than to know if we're crediting the seller for property taxes, we have to be debiting the buyer for the property taxes. So that takes care of the credits and debits part. Then, and only then, do we work on which part of the year. Don't even try to think about which part of the year until you figured out your credits and debits. Once you figured out your credits and debits, then you can focus on the portion of the year that's a problem. And the portion of the year that was the problem here, the seller should not have paid for the red portion of the year. It was unfair that the seller paid for the red portion. So therefore, that's the portion of the year we need to prorate, we need to deal with. So now that we know we're dealing with December 11th through December 30th, let's continue to work with that. And let's talk about how many days that is. I don't ever like to count buyer days. Anytime you start counting buyer days, you have to get into that whole, do I do the +1? Do I not do the +1? It's the whole problem that we have with interim interest. It's just asking for trouble. It is much easier, in my opinion, to deal with the seller's days. And then if you need the buyer's days, just subtract them from 360. It's easy to do the seller's days. Look at it this way. If we're closing in December, we have all of January, February. In fact, let me switch this to green so we can keep it consistent here. The seller owed for all of January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and then they owed for 10 days in December. So we can simply count and say, okay, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times 30. That's 300 days plus the 10. So basically we got 10 full months of 30 days is 300. 300 plus the 10 days in December is, in fact, we got 11. I miscounted. I can't count today. That's why I have to check myself. That's why I write it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There we go. 11 times 30. That's why I do it longhand. I'm telling you, it's so easy to make mistakes in these things. 330 days, 330, plus the 10 days in December is 340 days. So we have 340 days for the seller. Okay, the seller's got 340. Well, 340 minus, so let's switch over to red here so we can do the buyer side. 360 minus the 340 gives us 20 days over here on the buyer side. Well, that's the side we want to focus on, so 20 days. Yes, it's time consuming. Yes, it's painful, but we'll get it right. When you write it out longhand, you can see what you're working with. It will get it right. Do you want to be in a hurry and get it wrong? Or do you want to take 30 extra seconds and get these things right? I would say take the 30 extra seconds and get it right. So 20 days here. 20 days. And you might have to write that down again for yourself, just to remind yourself, I'm focusing on 20 days. So now, what do we know here about this thing? We know that the annual tax bill is $26.40. Okay, so let me swap back over here. $26.40 divided by the 360 is going to get us down to a daily amount is $7, 7.3333 per day, times our 20 days. that equals 146.66 or 67, either one, dollars. Okay, $146.66 or 67 cents. If we were rounding, I suppose we should do 67, but it really doesn't matter. Whatever your answer there is, if you're off by a few pennies, it's fine. And we already said it was 146.67 credit seller. And that's why it's so important to write all this stuff down as you do it, because I'm not having to go back and think at this point of what it is. Credit seller, debit buyer. I already wrote that down. So I can only focus on one piece of it at a time. If you try to keep it all working in your mind, am I crediting, am I debiting, and how much, and what part of the year, it's too much. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for anybody if you try to do it that way. You work yourself too hard. Write it down in small, digestible pieces, and you'll be able to deal with these prorations. Okay, let's look at number 4. It says a home is scheduled to close on April 28th of 2020, has an annual property tax bill of $7,480. The tax bill will be paid in full later in the year by the buyer. Okay. Based on this information, what's the correct closing statement entry for this proration for both the buyer and the seller? So they want the closing statement. So that's going to be my debits and credits. It's a proration, so I need a calendar. Seller on the left, buyer on the right. It's property taxes, so that's January 1 through December 30th. There's my timeline. Here's my closing here, April 28th. Okay. And let me do my little highlighting thing here. I got the seller side over here. And then I got the buyer side over here. Okay. And now I'm going to write down what happened. Okay. It says tax bill will be paid in full later in the year by the buyer. So buyer pays entire bill. Not fair. Not fair. Not fair that the buyer is paying this and that. They should have only paid the red portion. They should have never paid the green portion. So, unfair to the buyer, that means credit buyer. That means debit seller. So, the credits and debits are taken care of. Now, I need to ask myself, what was the unfair part of the year? What was unfairly paid by the buyer? Is the green part the unfair part for the buyer, or is the red part the unfair part for the buyer? Well, the red part seems pretty fair to me. That's the buyer's part of the year. That's the buyer's side of the timeline. They should have paid the red part. That's not the problem. Problem is over here. The buyer should not have paid for that period of time at the beginning of the year. So we want to credit the buyer, debit the seller for January 1 through April 28th. There's our period of time. Work yourself through it in those pieces. Credit the buyer, debit the seller for January 1 through April 28th. So now we need to know a number of days. So I'm going to say, okay, well, that's January, February, March, all of those, plus 28 days in April. Okay, so that's 30 times 3, 90, plus 28, it's 118 days. Okay, 118 days that we're doing our credit debit for. So now let's turn back to the actual math of it. They told us that this annual bill is $7,480. We're going to divide that by 360. 7480 divided by 360 equals $20.7777 per day. Times 118 days, because we already decided that. Again, not second guessing ourselves, not overthinking things. We've already decided it's 118 days. That is a total of 2,451 and about 78 cents, somewhere around that. And we already said that was credit buyer. and debit seller. So 24.5178 or so cents, credit buyer, debit seller. That's your entry on your closing statement for number 4. That's number 4 in its entirety. Again, it's all about progressing through those steps. And I promise the more you do of these, the more you watch these, the easier it will get to see that progression of how you work through this. All right? Let's look at number 5 here. It says Susie Seller's under contract to sell her home to Bill Buyer. They've agreed to a closing date of November 12th. Susie Seller paid the property tax bill when it arrived in September. Based on this information, what would be the correct entry into the closing statement for both the buyer and the seller on this transaction? So they want to know the closing statement entry. We know it's a proration. Draw the timeline. Don't get lazy. Seller on the left, buyer on the right. We know it's property taxes, so that's a full year. So January 1 through December 30th. It's important to write the timeline down too, because if it's something like rent, it won't be for the year, it'll be for a month that you'll be prorating. So I think it's important to write down the January 1 through December 30th. Plus, that's going to help you clearly see the dates that you're going to be dealing with. Closing date is November 12th. Close to the end of the year. Okay, well, here's my buyer side of the year. Here's my seller side of the year right here. Now I'm going to write down what happened. It says Susie Seller paid the property tax bill when it arrived in September. So seller paid entire bill. Not fair. Seller paid both portions. Not fair. Credit seller. To make it fair, to fix it, we want to credit the person who was treated unfairly. Credit seller means also debit buyer. Okay? Now we want to talk about the period of time. What was the unfair thing? Well, the seller paid both the green and the red portions of the year. Seller paid the entire year. Seller owed the green portion. That's not unfair. Seller did not owe the red portion. The red portion was unfair treatment for the seller. So the period of time that I'm debiting and crediting here is going to be from November 13th, the period after closing, through December 30th. November 13th through December 30th. Now remember, I don't like to count days at the end of the year, even though that's the number of days I'm looking for here. What I would do is break it down into seller buyer numbers and then take the side I need. So with my seller buyer numbers, here's what I'm going to look at on the seller side. If I'm looking at the seller side here, and I'll switch over to green just to kind of keep it consistent, I'm looking at the seller owning the property January through October. That is 10 months of 30 days. If you need to write them out to count them, that's fine, which equals 300. Plus, we're going 12 days into November. That's 312 days. And then I'm looking at the buyer side, and I'm saying, okay, well, the buyer side is 360 minus the 312 over there. That's 48 days for the buyer. And it's the buyer side that I'm looking at here. So now I know my proration is going to be for 48 days. I literally have everything done except the math now. Okay? I have everything done except the math. And guess what? On this one, they didn't even give me any math to work with. They didn't even give me a bill. They didn't give me any way to calculate the bill. You're going to see that on the test. So what do they want to know? The answer is right here. We're done. We want to credit the seller and debit the buyer for the period of time from November 13th through December 30th. There's your answer. Credit the seller, debit the buyer for the period of time from November the 13th through December 30th. We can't go any further than that. That's as far as we can go. And that might show up as an answer on a test. So you need to know how to do it without even actually having the numbers in there. And that's why it's all about writing this out longhand and not just firing numbers into a calculator. If you're in the habit of just firing numbers into a calculator, that's a really bad habit and it will cost you on the test. So you really need to be writing this out. Credit seller, debit buyer, okay, what period of time? So this is just to condition you for that. All right. Number 6. A home is scheduled for settlement on May 14th for the sales price of $385,000. The annual property tax bill for the year will be prorated according to North Carolina practice. Okay. What will be the entry into the closing disclosure statement for both the buyer and the seller? Okay. So again, it's a property tax proration. Draw my calendar. The seller's on the left. My buyer's over here on the right. My year starts January 1. It ends December 30th. My closing is May, okay, 14th, so somewhere right in here. My seller side's right there. My buyer side over here is right there. It says the annual property tax bill for the year will be prorated according to North Carolina practice, okay? What will be the entry into the closing disclosure statement? Well, man, I got a problem here. They didn't tell me what's happening with the tax bill. They didn't tell me who's being treated unfairly. This is a question where they're expecting you to recognize the date tells you everything. The date here is super important. If the closing is happening on May 14th, the tax bill has not been paid. We know that because the tax bill doesn't even come out until September. If the tax bill doesn't even come out till September, there's no way it's been paid. There's also no way that the seller is going to ever see this tax bill because the closing is going to happen a long time before we ever get to the tax bill being issued or due. What that means is that the buyer is going to get stuck with the entire tax bill. So what I'm going to write down is buyer will pay entire bill. And that's a conclusion you need to be able to come to simply based on your knowledge of property taxation in North Carolina when those bills are issued. The bills are not even issued until September. They don't have to be paid until the following January 5th. They're late the following January 6th, but they can't be paid prior to September because there is no bill to pay. So if the buyer's paying the entire bill, the buyer's paying both portions. That's not fair. It's unfair to the buyer. So we're going to credit buyer, debit seller. Give the credit to the one that's being treated unfairly. So now let's talk about the unfair treatment. What was unfair here? Is the red portion unfair or is the green portion unfair? For the buyer, because it's the buyer that we're worried about. Buyer was treated unfairly. Buyer should not have paid the green portion over here. That should have been the seller's responsibility. So credit buyer, debit seller for the period beginning January 1 and ending May 14th. So now we would be ready to prorate the bill. They didn't give us the bill. So we look to see, did they give us anything to calculate the bill? No. There's your final answer. Credit the buyer, debit the seller for the period of time from January 1 through May 14th. And if you wanted to count the number of days, we could do that. That's January, February, March, April. So that's 30 times 4, 120, plus the 14 days in May, 134 days. So that credit debit is going to be for 134 days that we're going to credit the buyer for and debit the seller for. Okay. Number 7. It says a home that's being closed by Winker Law of Charlotte on February 10th has an assessed valuation with the county of $342,850 and is being sold for $415,000. Mecklenburg County charges an ad valorem tax rate of $1.03 per 100. Based on this information, what is the correct entry into the closing disclosure statement for prorated property taxes for the year for both buyer and seller? Okay, well, same dance again. Looks like a proration question. Draw my timeline. Put my seller on the left. Put my buyer on the right. It's property taxes, so that's a full year. So January 1 through December 30th. And then we've got our closing here early in the year, February 10th. Okay. So here's my buyer's portion of the year. Here's my seller's portion of the year. You can have multiple colors, by the way, of pens with your dry erase board, so you can do this kind of thing too during the test. Okay, not doing anything you can't do. So let's write down what happened here. It says it's being closed by Winker Law of Charlotte on February 10th. Okay, this is another one where they didn't tell us what's happening with the tax bill, but we certainly know February it hasn't been paid, which means the buyer's going to get stuck with the bill when it comes out way down the road in September. So, I mean, because think about it, the bill's not going to come out till like here, if you think about it that way. So that means buyer is going to have to pay the entire tax bill. Buyer will pay entire bill. Not fair. Not fair. Unfair to the buyer. Credit buyer. Debit seller. Now let's talk about the part of the year that's unfair. The buyer paid for both portions. The buyer should not have paid for the green portion. That was the seller's responsibility. So we're crediting the buyer and debiting the seller for the period from January 1 through February 10th. And if we get number of days is going to be January is 30 days plus 10 in February, 40 days. So we're crediting the buyer for 40 days of property taxes. Now on this one, they gave us numbers. On this one, we can do the work. On this one, they didn't give us a tax bill, but they did give us everything we would need to calculate a tax bill, because we know that tax bill is going to be equal to the assessed value times the rate. Well, they told us the rate was $1.03, so 1.03%. You can put that in there. Now, they gave us two numbers for valuation. They gave us an assessed value and the sales price. For tax purposes, it's the assessed value. So $342,850 times 1.03%. That equals a tax bill of $3,531 and 36 cents or so for the year. Now we can break that down into daily. So 35, 31, and 36 cents divided by 360 will give us a daily rate of 9 and about 81 cents, 8093 per day, times our 40 days. That equals $392 and about 37 cents. And we already said that's credit buyer and debit seller. Again, just sort of very methodically working our way through it. 392, 37 credit buyer, debit seller. Notice I didn't think about that at the end. I just went back and wrote down the same thing I'd already done. That's why I think getting the debits and credits, getting the number of days first, ultra important. Okay. All right. Number 8. Karen is selling her home in Lansing, Michigan, with the anticipated settlement taking place on June 10th of 2022. The market value of the home is $256,500, and Michigan charges ad valorem property taxes based on 60% of market value. Lansing has a mill rate of 27. Based on this information, what are the correct closing statement entries for both the buyer and seller into the closing statement? I will go out on a limb here and tell you that this is far more complex than what you could expect to see on a test, because this is asking you to do a lot here. But it's a great question for you to practice with all of the math skills that we've learned throughout the class, because there really is some of everything almost in here. There's not finance math in here, but there's really a lot of everything in here. Here's the thing. I know it's a proration question. Whether you do the math right or not, you should be able to get the periods of time right. And that's the first thing to focus on. Focus on what we definitely can do, okay? We know it's a proration. We know we've got our seller over here on the left. We know we've got our buyer over here on the right. All right, we're prorating property taxes, so we know that begins January 1 and ends December 30th. Okay, those are things we know. Closing is happening pretty much dead center of the year here, June 10th. Okay, we know that. We know that this portion of the year over here is the sellers. We know that this portion of the year over here is the buyers. Those are all things we know. Okay, let's see what else they tell us. Did they tell us who's getting screwed here? Well, they told us a date. They told us a date. And when they tell us a date, does that date tell us anything? I think it does. If the bill has not even come yet, it hasn't been paid yet. So what that means is that the buyer is going to get stuck with this entire bill because of the date, because of the closing date, and because the bill is not going to come out until after the closing date, somewhere like in there. Well, buyer will pay entire year. When the bill comes, the buyer's going to get stuck with the whole thing. Not fair. Unfair. Shouldn't happen. Unfair to the buyer. So credit the buyer. Which means debit the seller. Now let's focus on the unfair period of time. The red period of time, the buyer should have paid for. That's fair. The green period of time, the buyer should have never paid for. That's what we need to fix. So we need to go from January 1 through June 10th. And let's talk about how many days that is. Okay, so I'm going to go over here on the margins. I've got January, February, March, April, May. So that's 30 times 5. It's 150. Plus I've got 10 in June is 160. Okay, so 160 days. Now I got everything I need to know to actually do this math. Okay, it says the market value of the home is $256,500, and Michigan charges an ad valorem property taxes based on 60% of market value. Okay, so first thing I need to do is figure out what the tax value, the assessed tax value of this thing is. $256,500 times the 60%. Okay. That's an assessed value of $153,900 for tax purposes. Now, I know that to calculate a tax bill, I can take my assessed value, which we now know is $153,900, and multiply it times my rate. What rate did they give me? Oh, they gave me one of those stupid mill rate things. Man, it's been a long time since I've seen one of those. Mill rate. To get rid of a mill rate, to make it useful, folks, divide it by 10. That mill rate, we can divide it by 10. So if we take the mill rate of 27 and we divide it by 10, we get it's the same thing as $2.70 or 2.7% for our rate. So our rate down here is going to become this 2.7% times the 153.9. That's a tax bill of $4,155.30 per year. If we divide that by 360, that gives us 11,5425 per day. We go right back to the stuff we did earlier, times 160 days. Okay. 11.5425 times 160. And that gives us a prorated amount of $1,846.80. And we already wrote down that that is going to be credit buyer, debit seller. Now, again, I understand with this question, this is a lot because it asks you to deal with mill rates and that doesn't give you a tax bill. I personally don't think they're going to go this far on the test. Here's the thing though. Everybody, no matter what your math level is, because getting the number of days correct, getting the debits and credits correct, has nothing to do with math. So you should be able to get that far. That's going to be enough to help you narrow it down to answer choices on the test. That's why you can't just throw your hands up and math. Because there may only be one answer choice, folks, that says credit buyer, debit seller. So you may not have had to do the math. I wanted to show you all the math to show you it can be done. Obviously, I would love in a perfect world for you to be able to do every step of the math along this way. But all of you should be able to know, okay, I'm crediting the buyer, I'm debiting the seller for January 1 through June 10th, which is 160 days. Everybody should be able to get that far. Then it does get to be, okay, all right, now I've got to get my assessed value, and then I've got to get the tax bill. Don't allow yourself to become frustrated if you couldn't get all 12 steps done. If you only got the first 2 steps done, you're well on your way to answering the question, especially with prorations. So make sure you stay kind of centered about that. All right, number 9. Says a rental property is scheduled to close on September 12th with rent having already been paid in full by the tenant on September 1. The monthly rent for the property is $4,800. Based on this information, how should rent be entered into the closing disclosure statement for both the buyer and the seller? Okay, it's still a proration, which means I need a timeline. I always put the seller on the left-hand side of the timeline. I always put the buyer on the right-hand side of the timeline. But this proration is not going to be from January 1 through December 30 because we're prorating rent. And rent is paid monthly. So we're only prorating 1 month worth of rent here. So what we want to do is look at just the month of closing. So our proration is going from September 1st through September 30th. Now I'm going to go through that again. You need to pay attention. And hopefully you've been writing January 1 through December 30th on all those other ones. Because if you just assume it's always a year, that's a mistake. Not all prorations are annual prorations. Only if the thing that's being prorated is annual. Well, in the case of property taxes are billed annually. So we were prorating a year. Rent is paid monthly. And if the rent is paid monthly, then we have to prorate it monthly. And so we're only looking at 1 month of time here to prorate. which is from September 1st through September 30th. Why September? Because that's the closing month here on this particular closing. So that's the one that and you could just do 1 through 30. It really doesn't matter the month, but we're saying September because that's the month they gave us here. Now, it says here the closing is on September 12th. Okay, so here we are, September 12th for our closing. We're going to do the same thing we've done before. We've got our buyer side of the prorated period. We've got our seller side of the prorated period. Now we want to write down what happened. It says rent's already been paid in full by the tenant on September 1. Well, if rent was paid on September 1, it all went to the seller. So all rent went to seller. That's not fair. But who's it not fair to? It's not the seller who got screwed here. It's the buyer. In fact, the seller got way too much money. Way too much money. Because the seller got $4,800 and they're only going to own this property for 12 days. The buyer's getting screwed. We have to fix that. So we credit the buyer, which means we debit the seller. So now let's talk about the period of time that is unfair. Where's the unfair treatment here? What period of time was a mistake? What period of time did the seller get rent for that they should not have gotten rent for? What period of time did the buyer not get rent for that they should be getting rent for? It's the same period of time. Only one of these was handled wrong. The green period is right. Seller got rent for the green period. Seller should have had rent for the green period. The red period is wrong. This period of time right here is wrong. And it's wrong because the seller got paid rent for that period when the rent should have gone to the buyer. So the period of time we're going to be looking at is from September 13th through September 30th. September 13th through the 30th. Now, the way I'm going to do the number of days is to say, okay, well, that's 30 minus the 12 that the seller should have gotten paid for. That's 18 days. Okay? So 18 days here. Because there are 30 days in the month, the seller should have gotten 12 of them. That leaves 18 days that we need to fix. So again, before you do any math at all, before you even think about the math, you should know that you can credit the buyer and debit the seller for the period of time from September 13th through September 30th, which is a total of 18 days. Now let's look at how that's going to break down with the math. We know the rent is $4,800 per month. We know that there are 30 days in the month. So if we divide that by 30, we should be able to get ourselves a daily amount. Okay, 4,800 divided by 30. That is $160 per day. We don't need to think about how many days. We already figured that out. Times 18 days. Okay? 160 times 18. That is $2,880. And we already wrote down again, no thinking aloud, credit buyer, debit seller, and there we are. $2,880, credit buyer, debit seller. Work your way through it. Baby steps. It's the best way with these prorations. Okay. Number 10. Okay, we got 2 more. Couldn't remember how many questions I gave you. Number 10 says an apartment complex with 6 units that each rent for $1,500 monthly is being sold as of January 24th. What entry is appropriate in the settlement statement for both the buyer and seller to handle this proration? So again, it's a proration. We're looking for a closing statement entry. That means debits and credits. We got our seller on the left. We got our buyer on the right. We're prorating rent. Rent is paid monthly. So we're going from January 1 through January 30th. That's what we're prorating here. And the closing is happening out here January 24th. There's our closing. So we've got our seller's portion of the month here. We've got our buyer's portion of the month there. Now we want to write down what happened, okay? It says an apartment complex with 6 units that each rent for $1,500 is being sold as of January 24. What entry is appropriate? Well, they didn't tell us what happened with the rent. So we have to know if it's the 24th. Rent has been paid to the seller for the full month. So seller, my pen does that. Seller collected all rent. So the seller got the rent for the green part. The seller also got the rent for the red part. Not fair. Not fair to the buyer. Buyer might not be owed a lot of rent here because they didn't own the property for very long, but they're owed some rent. So that means we need to credit the buyer, which of course means we need to debit the seller for this proration. So let's talk about the period of time that's wrong. The seller got rent for both the green and red periods. The seller was only supposed to get rent for the green period. This period is wrong. The red period is wrong. The seller should have never gotten that rent. That rent is essentially stolen. The seller has gotten money they were not entitled to. We need to fix that. So the period of time we're going to deal with is January 25th. The period of time after closing is January 25th through January 30th. And if we want to do that number of days, I'm going to say, okay, well, there's 30 days in the month. The seller should have collected 24. That leaves 6 days that the buyer is getting screwed on. 6 days that the buyer should get some rent. So we got 6-day proration here for this transaction. So now let's look at the math of the thing. It says the rent is $1,500 per month, but there's 6 units. Well, if we're collecting $1,500 per unit, we need to multiply that times 6 to get our total rent collection here. That's $9,000 in monthly rent. $9,000 a month. Well, we know there are 30 days in that month. That's $300 a day. And we already know based on our previous work up there that we're doing 6 days. So $300 a day times 6 days is $1,800. And we said that was going to be credit to buyer and debit seller. $1,800 credit buyer, debit seller. All right, number 11. A home is being sold with the scheduled closing of October 12th, 2022. The home is located in a neighborhood with monthly HOA dues. Oh, we haven't seen HOA dues before. Monthly HOA dues of $120. The dues for October are not yet paid as of the closing date, and the buyer will have to pay them later in the month. Based on this information, what's the correct entry into the closing disclosure statement for this proration? Well, we haven't seen HOA dues before, but they work just like any other proration. Draw your timeline. Put your seller on the left, your buyer on the right. Now, let's talk about what we're prorating. It says monthly HOA dues. So we're looking at the first of the month which in this case is October 1st, through October 30th. And it says our closing is happening on October 12th. So we know, based on past experience, we've got the buyer's part of the month there. We've got the seller's part of the month there. Okay. Got our nice little visual representation of what's going on here. Now we need to write down what happened so we can talk about why that's not fair. It says, the dues for October are not yet paid as of the closing date, and the buyer will have to pay them later in the month. So buyer is paying all the dues. So the buyer's paying for that portion and that portion. That is not fair. It's unfair treatment of the buyer. Credit buyer. Because it's unfair to the buyer. Always credit the person who's been treated unfairly, which means debit seller. Credit buyer, debit seller. Now, let's figure out the period of time that was the problem. The buyer paid for the green portion. The buyer paid for the red portion. The buyer should have paid for the red portion. That was their portion. The buyer should not have paid for this portion. This is a problem. So, period of time is going to be October 1 through October 12th. That's 12 days. I don't need much math to figure that out. I'm ready to do some math now. They told us that the HOA dues are $120 a month. If I divide that by 30, I should get a daily rate. Okay? I think it's $4. Yeah, $4. $4 per day. Times 12 days. 48 bucks. $4 times 12, 48. So my proration is going to be $48. Credit buyer, debit seller. Again, just that sort of step by step tearing that thing apart. Okay? Step by step, breaking it down into its pieces, and you can work your way through these. But they really are about that process, that repetitive process. And if you work your way through that process on these prorations, you'll be able to get them. At least get to the point where you can get the debits and credits straight and the period of time straight. And then add the math in. Slowly but surely, you will get there. Good luck.